If you're trying to use a loop for your beat but you can't figure out a way to keep the beat interesting and not repetitive, today's video is for you. I'm going to show you guys 7 different changes that you can make to your loop to make a better beat. Alright, so I'm sure you've been in this position before. You have your loop here. You have all of your drums programmed. Now it comes time to structure your beat out, but you run into a problem. The beat is starting to sound boring after a few bars, and all you can really do is make changes to the drums or the bass, but even still, that's not enough to keep the beat sounding interesting. And you have no idea how you can change this loop to create some variation in the beat. Well, that's what I want to show you guys today, a few ideas that you can use if you run into this problem. First thing that you can do is the idea of repitching your loop. Now the first step, if you wanted to do this, would be to go into your loop, make it unique. You would double click the new unique loop here, and you would change the pitch just using this dial here. Typically, if you want to repitch your loop, going up or down 12 semitones is going to be the most easy and quick way of doing this. If you jump up or down in octaves, nothing in your beat actually changes musically speaking. If you have other instruments in your beat, you won't have to make any adjustments to those if you don't want to. But there is something else important that you need to keep in mind if you do this technique. As of right now, the frequency spectrum that our main loop takes up is very distinct. The listener hears it and they get used to the beat sounding a certain way and having a certain overall balance. But you guys can see, as soon as we get to the pitch shifted area, the entire frequency spectrum shifts. And this might be a very jarring thing to hear, and it'll have the beat sounding very unbalanced. We basically took the cornerstone of the beat, the central focus point, and we changed the tonality of it. So to help these two sections feel a little bit more balanced and the beat sound a little bit more cohesive overall, it might be a good idea to put an EQ on your repitched loop here. For example, since I pitched my loop down, what I need to do is boost the frequencies that my original loop had most of its presence in, and cut some of the new frequencies that my original loop didn't have. So here's an EQ shape that I eventually came up with on my new repitched loop. As you guys can see, there's a huge cut in the low end just because our original loop didn't have as much low end presence. As well, I made a boost to the mid-range frequencies just to try my best to get it to a similar level that the original loop was at. And so these two sections between my normal loop and my repitched loop won't sound as different and unbalanced. You guys can hear the difference if I took this EQ off. It almost felt like we were missing something as soon as that pitch down loop started to play, and the reason why is because there's such a huge shift in the overall frequency spectrum of the beat. It just sounded very unbalanced and just not all that pleasant. Now instead of repitching my loop an entire octave, let's say for example I want to change this to -500 cents or -5 semitones. Not only will this same balance issue apply, but you'll also have to change what your other instruments are doing musically. You guys can see I made a change to my 808 pattern for the new section. So these are the notes that my original loop was playing at. We have C, A sharp, and then down to a G. But when we get to the section where I repitched my loop down 5 semitones, we have a whole bunch of other notes here. We have a G, an F, and a D. I basically repitched the 808 pattern down 5 semitones as well. As well, to get the transition in between each of these two sections to be a little bit more fluid, you guys can see I created a little bass fill here. As well, I played around with the drums and the loop in this little section right here as well. So these are some of the things that you might have to do if you want to get the transition in between these two sections to be a little bit more fluid. Small little transitions like this are always helpful in between the different sections of your beat, no matter what type of change you're making. But in my opinion, these are especially helpful when you have two sections that are different musically. So again, pitching your loop up or down in octaves most likely won't require you to change any of the other musical components in your beat, whereas if you make a change in your loop in anything else other than an octave, you most likely will. And one quick note, when you do this, make sure in the time stretching settings here with the mode, make sure resample is not selected. The next thing that you can do to your loop to make a more interesting beat is to chop it up. The idea here is that we want to take our loop and rearrange some of the notes, the chords, or the phrases in the loop and do something different melodically. The way to do this is open up either Fruity Slicer, Slice X, or what I like to use is Momentum, and drag your sample into it. And what you want to do is try to come up with something that's just a little bit different than the normal loop. This is a great way to create variation in your beat, but as you guys know, chopping and sampling is a skill on its own, which might be a bit difficult. I would say if you want to try this technique, it might be a good idea to start off by taking bigger slices, bigger phrases from the loop and try rearranging those. Some producers like to chop up every single note in the sample or the loop and create their own arrangement, and by no means is that a bad thing to do, but it will require a lot more effort when you're trying to come up with a new section for your beat when you're chopping, which might prove to be a little bit more difficult and honestly even at times unnecessary. Now, depending on the new chopped arrangement that you come up with, you might have to change some of the other elements in your beat as well. After all, we are changing which notes are playing and when they're playing when we do this, so you might need to rearrange some of the other melodic components in your beat to suit this new chopped arrangement that you come up with. Fortunately for me, I was able to chop and rearrange this loop to create a new variation, but still keep all the other components in the same in the beat and still have it work, which is why this transition sounds so fluid and just works perfectly with the original section. More often than not though, if you find yourself having to make these huge overhauls both rhythmically and musically to the other components in your beat after you rearrange your chopped up loop, you might want to simplify and just try something a little bit more basic. The reason why is because if you change too many of the components in your beat, the new arrangement that you came up with the new chopped up loop, it might not work with the original loop as well, and you'll just end up having a very disjointed and a non-cohesive beat. Again, achieving balance from your original loop to the new one that we're creating here is really important. Next up, somewhat similar to what we just did here, is rhythm manipulation. So this is more so the idea of using rhythm tools on top of your loop to create variation in your beat. So this would be things like halftime or gross beat or M-rhythmizer or shaper box. Those are some really common ones. These are tools that take your loop and reshuffles them based on whatever setting that you choose. So one way of doing this is adding the effect right on top of your loop. Pick whatever pattern that you want. You're going to right click on the wet dry knob here and then click create automation clip. And then in the playlist you'll have this setting all the way down when you want the original loop to play. And then you're going to turn this effect all the way up whenever you want the new rhythm manipulated loop to play in that section. So this is a fast and easy way to create some variation in your beat, but based on the pattern that you choose in your rhythm manipulation tool, it can be a bit jarring and disorienting. For example, if I used a pattern like this, as well, when you do this technique, it might be a good idea to change the rhythm of some of the other components in your beat as well, just to help establish a new feel to this section. So what I did here was I changed up the snare pattern slightly whenever the rhythm tool was turned on, and also made a slight adjustment to the hi-hat pattern as well. But I did keep the kick pattern as well as the 808 pattern the exact same. Again, I don't want to get too extreme and throw off the balance in between these two sections. I still do want to maintain some sort of continuity. Compared to chopping and rearranging, in my opinion, the focus there is more so placed on musicality. We're trying to create something different from our original loop melodically. With this technique here, there's more of a glitchy feel to this pattern. I'm less focused on changing the melody. Our emphasis with this technique is more focused on changing the rhythm of the loop as opposed to the musicality of it. One thing that I do want to note, I know a lot of people like to use halftime when they do this type of technique, but just know that when you use halftime, it does repitch the loop that you're working on. So you might have to re-EQ your loop like I showed you guys in the very first example if you try to use halftime on your loop. Next up, we can create some variation with our loop using creative effects. You guys can hear how this sounds. Here, what I chose to put on top of the loop were some creative effects like filter freak, as well as some delay with replica. The intention here is to use your shaping tools creatively and have your loop sounding new and different. And based on the tools that you use, you can come up with some pretty extreme ideas here. Typical tools for this type of technique are things like reverb, filtering, delay, as well as distortion, for example. And just like we used our rhythm tool, what I did here was I right-clicked on the dry and wet knob, I created an automation clip, and I basically turned these tools on when I wanted to create some variation in the beat. And with these tools, I can also be creative in how much I want these tools to be on during the beat as well. And like I mentioned, based on the tools that you use or the presets that you use in them, you can come up with some pretty extravagant ideas. But once again, one of the things that you should look out for is how these tools reshape your sound. After I put these effects on top of my loop, you guys can see I added an EQ on top as well. I basically had to reshape the frequencies of this new loop once we added these tools on top, just to closer match the original loop. You guys can hear how this would sound if I didn't have this on top. There's just a lot more going on in some of the frequencies that didn't exist in the original loop, so I had to re-EQ those to balance it out. Another technique that you can use in your loops is reversing the sample. Granted, this only works on certain types of samples. If this loop here had a bunch of drums on top of it, a bunch of other instruments, this probably would sound a lot more messy and just wouldn't work. So to do this technique, what you do is just double click on top of your loop, and then you'd hit reverse. You guys can see the entire waveform is basically in reverse now. Or again, you could use a sampler like Fruity Slicer or Slice X and do this exact same thing in there. A few things to note though, I should point out. I did have to chop up the sample a tiny bit just so this would make sense. If I didn't, you guys can hear how this would sound. Musically, it just doesn't make as much sense, so I did have to rearrange these chops after I reversed it. I also changed the 808 pattern here, which is the only other melodic component in this beat, just to help fit the new arrangement that I came up with here. So to get this to work, very rarely can you just hit the reverse button and then lay back and have your beat sounding good. You will probably have to do some additional work afterwards. The good thing about this technique, beyond having to do that extra work, is that afterwards it'll probably be pretty easy to have the new section that you came up with fit with the old section. There's still going to be a tonal cohesion in between my two sections here. Next up, what we can do is try to use a splitting tool. Granted, I will say right off the top, there is a pretty low chance that this will work, but if it does, it can have some pretty cool results. There are tools or plugins that you can try to use to take your loop and split it out into its individual components, albeit not perfectly. For example, one plugin that can do this is Regroover Pro. Once I threw the loop inside of this plugin, it basically tried to split out the different components of the loop into its own sections. For example, these two stems right here, this is the top line piano that was playing in my original loop. It basically split out the bottom notes and removed them completely. At this point, I could go ahead and try to play some of those lower notes myself, come up with a variation, and create a new section in the beat like that. Or I could grab an entirely different instrument and try to play those bottom notes the exact same. This opens up a lot of possibilities if it works. Typically, a tool like this works best if you have multiple instruments that are very distinct from each other. So for example, if my loop had a flute and a bass guitar, this would probably work very well. Just sounds that have very distinct frequencies that they take up. By no means do I want to give you guys the impression that these types of tools can magically take your loops and just split them out into individual instruments and be perfectly clean and usable. And when it does work, it probably won't work all that perfectly. You guys can hear it if I just solo the layer right here. It sort of goes in and out in terms of the volume, and it doesn't capture all the notes perfectly. This tool is more so designed for drum loops. If you use it for that intention, this tool actually works really well. It can easily split out your hi-hats, your snares, your kicks if you try to drag a drum loop into this. It works pretty good for that intention. But for regular loops like this, it won't work as well, but nonetheless, it's just something I wanted to show you guys. And finally, probably one of my favorite methods to use whenever I have a loop is resynthesis. There are certain synths that allow you to drag your samples into them, and what they will basically do is apply a whole bunch of different effects on top of them and reshape your sounds completely. Your loop will start to sound like it's made up of an entirely different instrument. The notes that are playing are the exact same, but the sound itself starts to shift to be something new. One tool that exists in FL Studio is Harmor. For those that don't have FL Studio, using Isotope's Iris 2 is a comparable tool that also allows you to do resynthesis. So what you do is go into your image resynthesis tab right here, and you can just drag your sample into this little box right here. And just like that, you get a pretty cool, unique sounding instrument. And you can easily play with different pitches and it'll automatically stretch out your sample. Now you guys can hear there is a little bit of roughness, so you will likely have to reshape it using EQ and other types of effects to have this sounding good. But inside of the plugin as well, you have a whole host of controls that you can manipulate and change to have this loop sounding a little bit different as well. So once I did clean up my new resynthesized loop, you guys can hear how this sounds. You can create some pretty cool and unique results easily. And what's great is that you can test out a bunch of resynthesis settings using the presets in Harmor. For example, if I went and I changed this to this preset here, and then once again I drag in my sample, it sounds like a completely different instrument here as well. Now I will say in this video, all we've looked at is the different ways we can manipulate our loops to create variation in our beats. If you want a more fundamental look at the different arrangement techniques that you can use to improve your beats, I really recommend watching the video right above my head. It'll show you the different approaches that you should keep in mind when you're structuring out your beat and you want some more variation in it. If you guys have found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have a technique that you like to use to manipulate your loops to create some more variation in your beats. My drum kit is available in the description box below. Join the Discord if you're interested in having your beats reviewed live, and I will see you guys next time.